thank you for having us today. Today we'll be kind of going through a series of papers, and so what I would like for our individual panelists is to kind of first introduce themselves and then go into discussing the individual papers. And then after that, I will then ask the chair to then give some comment on the individual papers. And then from then we'll kind of proceed going forward. Great, thank you. See, did you hear that? So my name is obviously Ulalani Jili, and I am moderating this panel. I'm a JD PhD student here at Harvard. That's not the point. And you're not here for me. So we'll kind of lead it to the individual panelists. And, just
Sure. Hi, Shuk-Ying Chan. Feel free to call me Ying. I'm a postdoc right now at Oxford, and I'm writing a book on anti-colonial thought and global justice. Happy to be here.
I'm Dan Zimmer. I'm an ABD PhD at Cornell. I work on anthropogenic existential risk and the history of political thought. Very happy to be here as well.
Hi everyone, I'm Ritik. I am a very lowly PhD student, so nowhere as near as these people, all of you are. So this is all a work in progress for me. This is not a book project or anything at the moment. This is something that I wrote for a coursework that I did, an essay, and I'm just presenting that essay. That's about it. Thank you all for coming and joining here.
Hi, I'm Bomi Choi, and I teach in the college social theory and critical theory. And yes, and I was asked to do this, but I was very pleasantly surprised that the topics actually totally spoke to me, and I think we'll have a fun discussion.
great. So could you kind of work us through your paper first, and then we'll kind of just follow accordingly down the line.
Oh, you want me to? Okay.
Yeah.
I thought following the program would be better.
Yeah.
Okay, well.
Easier.
Okay, sure.
Also, he has slides, so
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Right. So yeah, thank you so much for the organizers, especially Han-Song and Yineng, who've been taking care of us for 2 days. And thank you all for being here. So critics of liberal cosmopolitanism often say that it's imperialistic. Among other things, critics argue that liberal cosmopolitans tend to reject group rights in favor of individual rights, thereby disempowering post-colonial people's capacity to resist foreign and corporate encroachment. They argue that liberal cosmopolitans ignore race as a critical determinant of global injustice, and that they fail to theorize and identify hierarchies that reproduce imperial relations. But on the other side, on the opposite camp, statist theories of global justice tend to arrive at quite minimalist conclusions about the demands of global justice. On these accounts, and I'm thinking of people like David Miller, affluent states should help poor states secure conditions for basic justice, but global justice does not demand egalitarianism. Egalitarian projects such as ongoing global redistributions of wealth and capital, or projects of global democracy, on statist views, undermine the value of national self-determination and also national culture. Now, in her groundbreaking work, Adon Getachew recovers the history of anti-colonial internationalism and calls for what she calls a post-colonial cosmopolitanism based on anti-colonial commitments. This paper is an overview of a larger book project I've been working on, and it can be read as partly a response or taking up this urgent call. Drawing from the writings of Nehru, Nkrumah, Césaire, and Fanon, I argue that the value of equality, understood in relational terms, animates much of anti-colonial thinking, and that this can form a compelling basis for a view of post-colonial cosmopolitanism that avoids both the imperialistic pitfalls of liberal cosmopolitanism and the minimalism of statism. Anti-colonial thinkers diagnose colonialism as a social structure constituted by objectionable global and domestic hierarchies against which they proposed an egalitarian decolonial politics. This egalitarian face of decolonization, as I call it, has often been neglected because of exclusively nationalist receptions of the anti-colonial tradition. The work of historians like Frederick Cooper, Gary Wilder, Karuna Mentana, and others, which in different ways have pointed to the historic contingency of the nation-state as a vehicle of decolonization, gives us reason to move away from this reductionist reading of the anti-colonial canon. Instead, I argue that, at least in some currents of anti-colonial thinking, the nation-state and national independence were merely one part of a much broader and more ambitious decolonial agenda aimed centrally at transforming global and domestic relations of inequality. So the first section of the paper explores three recurring themes within these thinkers' writings that sit in tension with a reductive view of them as first and foremost nationalists. In the interest of time, I'll just briefly summarize these here. First, anti-colonial thinkers were deeply aware of the ethnic and cultural diversity amongst colonial subjects, and many saw this diversity as both a positive and inevitable feature. Second, they often argued that indigenous ruling elites were constitutive elements of the colonial order. And it's not uncommon to find in these anti-colonial writings explicit warnings against conflating rule by co-nationals with emancipation. And lastly, some of these texts, such as Nehru's discovery of India, even contained imaginations of a post-colonial world in which global political integration would transcend the nation-state. So these themes suggest that for these thinkers, cultural and ethnic national imaginaries were not at the root at their conceptions of the nation, even if they often invoke such imaginaries for political reasons. Instead, I argue in the paper that common subjection to colonialism, understood as structural inequality, is what marks out for these thinkers the boundaries of the colonized nation. The fundamental claim against colonialism, then, is not dependent on showing that colonizers and subjects bear different identities, but instead, it is a claim against the relational inequalities that created these politically salient identities in the first place. So now I'm going to turn to illustrate this egalitarian reconstruction of the anti-colonial critique and the corresponding account of decolonization to show how it has radical implications for global justice. So to start, anti-colonial thinkers often characterize colonialism as a form of institutionalized power grounded on a hierarchy between groups. Hierarchy shot through the political, economic, and social life of the colony. Politically, colonial rule was essentially, as Nkrumah states, quote, the undemocratic rule of majority by a minority, end quote. The minority controlled the majority through indigenous elites, such as the Indian princes who greatly troubled Nehru, and who had become deeply unpopular with the people, but hung on to power thanks to the British Empire. The first requirement of decolonization, then, is democratic reform. So Nkrumah, for example, at least from the outset, argues that the first step to legitimate government is to, quote, give every adult the right to vote, end quote. Doing so for Nkrumah is the first step to eradicating the deep divisions between racial and ethnic groups that resulted from British rule. But democratizing the colony was not enough. Decolonization also required democratizing the making of international law, or what we now call global governance. So Nehru, for example, was a vocal advocate of a democratic and inclusive, quote-unquote, world federation, which he sometimes also called, even more radically, Democratic World Union. He proposed this as an antithesis of the League of Nations or the British Commonwealth, and argued that nothing short of global democratic union would be able to resolve the root causes of war and imperialism, by which he meant poverty and racial hierarchy. So second, accompanying political hierarchy was economic inequality. For these socialist and Marxist-inflected thinkers, colonialism is often theorized as a process of primitive accumulation by foreign capitalists. As colonialists broke up communal forms of economic production and property ownership, they created a dispossessed peasantry and an urban proletariat. As Nehru details in The Discovery, colonial settlers as well as indigenous leaders became the new land-owning class. Moreover, colonial economics of dispossession and privatization not only impoverished the colony, but of course laid the groundwork for deep global inequalities between former colony and metropole later. So economic decolonization demanded both domestically space for post-colonial states to experiment with alternative forms of economic models, often variants of socialism, and also, and this in turn required at the global level, terms of trade and investment that allowed post-colonial states to draw on foreign capital and technology transfers without sacrificing their political control over the economy. So Nkrumah argues, for example, that foreign investment is crucial, but must be subjected to a national plan drawn up by a popular government that represents the masses. Importantly, for Nkrumah, and Fanon to a degree echoes this, developing local industry wasn't just important for decreasing reliance on capital-rich countries, but also for formerly oppressed populations to reclaim self-respect. And the last and the third component of colonial structural hierarchy is an ideology of racial hierarchy justifying and shaping political economic inequality. So the darker peoples of the world were told that white colonizers had, as neighbor states, quote, a God-given right to govern them and to keep them in subjection, end quote. Their cultures are deemed barbaric and backwards, and they're seen as passive consumers of the genius of the white man. An important consequence of living under colonial racism is that individuals gradually develop what Césaire calls an inferiority complex. They come to believe that their values, practices, way of life are inferior. They must become European to become equal. For Césaire and his colleagues in the Negritude movement then, an important part of decolonization was empowering post-colonial citizens to reclaim their status as value makers through engaging in cultural production. In doing so, Césaire stresses that he's not advocating for a return to past tradition, whatever that is, but instead he's calling for former colonial subjects to destigmatize their culture and appropriate its elements without shame, just as they should also reappropriate European culture for their own use. And in doing so, post-colonial citizens would be able to regain a sense of self-respect and compel others to see them as equal producers of value. So these three aspects of decolonization, political, economic, social, cultural, were central to these thinkers' vision of a genuinely post-colonial world understood as a world of relating to others as equals. And this account of decolonization makes a difference, I think, to how we think about global justice in at least three ways. First, the demandingness of global justice. Second, the scope of global justice inquiry. And lastly, the agents of global justice. So in the remaining time, I'll briefly discuss each point by illustrating what a post-colonial cosmopolitanism might look like. Now, first of all, post-colonial cosmopolitanism takes overcoming persistent colonial hierarchies, the kinds of hierarchies that I just elucidated from these thinkers, as a central aim of global justice. So this means that, first of all, contra status, global justice requires much more than reducing absolute poverty or extending humanitarian assistance. Instead, it requires egalitarian reforms aimed at continuously dismantling objectionable hierarchies and preventing their new formations between groups without a prior history of colonial entanglement. So this will demand ongoing global redistribution, but also, importantly, structural reforms to the terms of trade and investment that empower historically oppressed groups as value makers. For example, by attending to how these trade and investment terms continue to undermine society's capacity to diversify their economies and citizens' democratic control over land and resources. Second, if the aspiration for a just post-colonial world is to establish global relations of equality, then the site of global justice inquiry should not be limited to institutions that shape distributive outcomes. Instead, it should include also dominant ideas and discourses that circulate globally through patterns of cultural production and consumption, and which may contribute to the legitimation of continued hierarchies. Now, of course, post-colonial and media scholars have long pointed out the political significance of patterns of cultural globalization, where some groups, usually white and Western, continue to be dominant producers and disseminators of knowledge and culture. If we think about decolonization as a pursuit of equality, we don't need to rely on claims about the value of post-colonial national cultures, which are often essentializing and often also exclusionary, but instead we can rely on this idea of a claim to being seen as and also to exercising sort of equal agency as value makers, to see that current patterns of cultural globalization reproduce a ideology or hierarchy of racial superiority and inferiority. Now finally, reading anti-colonial critique as not wedded to the nation state opens up the possibility of a post-colonial cosmopolitanism that combines normative individualism with what I'll call political collectivism. Broadly, normative individualism is the idea that individuals and not groups are fundamental units of moral concern. But a focus on resisting objectionable hierarchies that the post-colonial perspective provides us with gives this account of cosmopolitanism strong reason to support the empowerment of groups. If collective agency amongst the subordinated is central to political resistance, then post-colonial cosmopolitanism can consistently defend collective rights for such groups, including, in cases such as the colony, a right to political self-determination in a newfound state. The moral basis of this group, for which collective rights are justified, need not be cultural or ethnic, even if such groups in practice often develop shared cultures across time. Instead, taking on the insight of these thinkers, common subjection to a persistent set of objectionable hierarchies can serve as the moral basis for this group's right to collective self-determination. But precisely because individuals are subjected to multiple intersecting hierarchies, post-colonial cosmopolitanism as anti-hierarchy need not privilege collective political agency in the form of the nation-state. Instead, subnational and transnational groups often share collective predicaments, and their political agency, if suitably empowered by institutions, may be more potent in resisting transnational forms of injustice. So the point is that taking individuals as the source and unit of moral concern should not entail abandoning the importance of collective political agency, and nor is such agency always best exercised through the nation-state. So to conclude very briefly, I've argued that we can understand anti-colonial critique as a form of egalitarianism that takes anti-hierarchy as a central value. Recovering the egalitarian face of decolonization not only broadens our understanding of the anti-colonial tradition, but I think also offers us important resources to theorize global justice in a post-colonial world that remains deeply unequal. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you to all the other speakers for their really fascinating papers, and to the organizers for assembling such a diverse group of people addressing these global issues. As you'll see, I'm somewhat of an outlier, so I'm especially glad to have been included in this kind of small C Catholic approach to globality. This work that I'm sharing with you takes shape in the context of a dissertation that looks at how the ability to destroy all life on Earth has affected the history of political thought, particularly in the 1950s during the global fallout crisis, and then in the 1980s as fears of nuclear weapons get recast in ecological terms. But then in between these two periods, there's this kind of spooky silence that descends after the Cuban Missile Crisis until about 1979, in which virtually no one talks about these issues. And it's right in the midst of this that Michel Foucault in 1976 has about a 6-month freakout that I'm about to relate to you. So, during his lifetime, Michel Foucault became famous for writing dense, erudite tomes such as Madness and Civilization and The Order of Things. Today, however, a surprisingly large proportion of Foucault's contemporary relevance rests not on these classic studies, but on a topic to which he devoted a mere 10 published pages in life, and about which roughly 50 pages have been published posthumously. The topic in question concerns biopolitics, a formulation that Foucault first introduced as a major breakthrough during a public lecture in 1976. Then, after signaling his intention to further develop the subject several times over the course of the next several years, he unceremoniously abandoned the topic. His passing but provocative claims on the subject were only rediscovered in the mid-1990s, a decade after Foucault's own untimely death. Since that time, what Foucault termed biopolitics has come to comprise a major field of research, but one overshadowed by a mystery, namely, why, if so many have found this theory to be so powerfully explanatory, did Foucault himself abandon it? In the time that I have, I hope to convince you of at least one reason that Foucault may have decided to drop the subject. This has to do with the disturbing discovery that his newly minted theory of biopolitics could not, in fact, explain the contemporary functioning of political power in the way that he hoped it would. This was because, as we will see shortly, the approach whose contours Foucault had tried to capture with his theory of biopolitics had already been radically altered by the recent appearance of what he himself came to call a power to kill life itself, that, in his words, quote, confronts the functioning of contemporary political power with a sort of paradox that is difficult, if not impossible, to get around, end quote. In order to make sense of the havoc that the appearance of the power to kill life itself caused, let me first pause to offer a brief background regarding Foucault's theory of biopolitics. In short, Foucault formulated his theory of biopolitics as a way of wrapping up a conspicuous loose end left over from his 1975 volume Discipline and Punish, which had famously opened by contrasting the grisly public torture and execution of a would-be French regicide in the mid-18th century with a humdrum timetable drawn up for French prisoners just a half-century later. His study had made waves by arguing that this transformation between spectacular forms of violence and the rise of gentler, reform-oriented institutions did not inherently mean that society was becoming more humane, but rather indicated that two very different modes of power were at play. On one side, he had argued, there stood the power associated with the sovereign. This was negative, subtractive, and ancient, dating back to however long ago rulers first began to use the threat of force to command obedience and subtract the lives and goods of their subjects through taxes, tortures, execution, and war. On the other side, Foucault identified what he called disciplinary power. This was, by contrast, relatively historically recent, having arisen around the end of the 18th century as new ways of knowing made it increasingly possible to track, invest, and normalize individuals by establishing a continuum of disciplinary institutions such as schools, clinics, barracks, factories, and prisons, the classical Foucauldian panoply of institutions. At the outset of that year's lecture in January of 1976, Foucault had expressed his conviction that, quote, sovereignty and discipline constitute, in an absolute sense, the general mechanisms of power in our society, end quote. At the same time, however, he also asserted that disciplinary power appeared to offer, quote, the exact point-for-point opposite of the mechanics of power that the theory of sovereignty described, end quote. How was it, Foucault wondered, that such seemingly diametrically opposed powers could cooperate in the same society? That March, in his final lecture, his epiphany came with the realization that he had misposed the problem, and that the opposition that he had identified between sovereign and disciplinary power actually belonged to a much broader tension between the old negative mechanisms of sovereign violence on the one hand, and a broader suite of administrative and technical capacities that had developed to positively shape, enrich, and multiply human lives on the other. He had been focusing on the individualizing disciplinary pole of this new positive power, he realized, while missing the way it also came to operate as a mass phenomenon. He now saw that, quote, unlike discipline, which is addressed to bodies, the new non-disciplinary power is applied not to man as body, but to the living man, to man as living being, ultimately, if you like, to man as species, end quote. Foucault termed this growing capacity to intervene in the dynamics of man as species biopower. This biopower had arisen alongside scientific breakthroughs in fields such as public health and demography that had constituted human populations as new fields of knowledge and objects of political intervention. He dubbed this ensuing tension between sovereign power to take life and the disciplinary and biopower to shape life, biopolitics. He was so excited by this new theory that he wrote up a 10-page précis that he included in the first volume of the History of Sexuality that he published that September, before letting the subject lapse into subsequent research. Why? My surmise is that in the course of formulating his theory of power, the power over what he calls man as species, Foucault came face to face with several threats to the survival of the human species that had previously escaped his theoretical notice. The transcript of Foucault's March lecture on biopolitics seems to capture his thoughts on the subject unfolding in real time. It's an admittedly long passage, but I believe a fairly astonishing one and well worth reading in full. To set the stage, by this point, Foucault has just finished delivering his theoretical account of biopolitics and is about to pivot to focus on a few historical examples. Before doing so, however, he pauses to sum up, quote, we are then in a power that has taken control of both the body and of life, or that has, if you like, taken control of life in general, with the body as one pole and the population as the other. We can therefore immediately identify the paradoxes that appear at the point where the exercise of biopower reaches its limits. The paradoxes become apparent if we look on the one hand at atomic power, which is not simply the power to kill, in accordance with the rights that are granted to any sovereign, millions and hundreds of millions of people. After all, that is traditional. What makes atomic power for the functioning of contemporary political power a sort of paradox that is difficult, if not impossible, to get around, is that in the power to manufacture and use the atom bomb, you bring into play the sovereign power that kills, but equally, that is the power to kill life itself. So the power that is being exercised in this atomic power is exercised in such a way that it is capable of suppressing life itself, and therefore to suppress itself insofar as it is the power that guarantees life. Either it is sovereign and uses the atom bomb, and therefore cannot be power, biopower, or the power to guarantee life itself, as it has been ever since the 19th century, or, at the opposite extreme, you no longer have a sovereign right that is in excess of biopower, but a biopower that is in excess of sovereign rights, end quote. There's a lot to say about this passage. In fact, I have a 13,000-word essay unpacking it in excruciating detail for anyone who may be interested. And it also gets into gene editing, which had just become a viable technology in 1973. And 1975, there's the Asilomar Conference. It's an angle that I couldn't address in my comments here, but I'm happy to talk about later. In the time that remains, however, I'll restrict myself to discussing the nature of the power to kill life itself and the challenge it posed to Foucault's newly minted theory of biopolitics. To understand the difficulties that atomic weapons pose for biopolitics, it is important to note at the outset that one of the most explanatorily powerful aspects of Foucault's new formula had been the way that it could compellingly account for not only the rise of phenomena such as mass public health campaigns, but also movements such as American eugenics and Nazi race madness as logical expressions of biopower. For by making the life process of human populations a new object of political intervention, the growing power over life had, counterintuitively, served to sanction mass sterilizations or exterminations committed by those who claimed to be serving the greater health of the species or the race. As I illustrate in the paper, the initial appearance of the atom bomb fit perfectly within the logic of biopolitics by providing a far more efficient way that sovereign violence could be used to erase entire populations from the air. As Foucault expressed it grimly but truly, killing millions or hundreds of millions of people falls well within the traditional bounds of sovereign right. Instead, as I try to show how the paradox that Foucault described earlier arose not directly as a product of atomic weapons, but as a result of the thermonuclear revolution of the 1950s, which saw weapons 1,000 times larger begin to be mass-produced by the tens of thousands, and first introduced the prospect of killing not just millions or even billions, but potentially all earthly life itself. He seemed to realize that, much like the biopower populations, the appearance of the power to kill life itself had brought into existence a new object of intervention, and with it a new set of political questions. Where biopower had constituted the life process of human populations as its object, the power to kill life itself had introduced what Foucault elsewhere called, quote, a threat affecting the whole human race and the fate of the world, end quote. Much like the biopower populations before it, the power to kill life itself had confronted contemporaries with a new object of knowledge and power, namely humanity as a whole and even the entirety of life on Earth. For the first time, humanity in its totality had ceased to be an object of abstract philosophical or humanist speculation, but instead become something that human beings could now directly affect, albeit only via its negation. In the biopolitics précis that he had included in the history of sexuality, Foucault writes of how, quote, what might be called a society's biological threshold of modernity has been reached when the life of a species is wagered on its own political strategies. For millennia, man remained what he was for Aristotle, a living animal with the additional capacity for a political existence. Modern man is an animal whose politics places his existence as a living being in question, end quote. Right as he was formalizing his theory of biopolitics, Foucault realized that the biopower over populations had come to be, if not wholly eclipsed, then at least significantly overshadowed by the power to kill life itself and affect humankind as an undifferentiated whole. Foucault's theory of biopolitics proves to be highly illuminating when applied to the period stretching between the appearance of biopower over populations in the 19th century and the rise of the power to kill life itself in the mid-20th. However, my argument is that the logic of biopolitics seems to encounter an insuperable hurdle when confronted with questions not just of the survival of this or that population or people, but the continued existence of people as such. For several centuries, Western conceptions of sovereignty had been synonymous with the right of the ruler to exercise the maximum force at her disposal to see that her will be done. The fundamental difference between a sovereign entity and a merely administrative unit had been that the former possessed the capacity to impose its will with the maximum amount of violence at its disposal and extend that imposition as far as it could before being checked by the counterforce of another sovereign. This means that, for those that possess them in sufficient number, thermonuclear weapons mark the self-canceling outer limit of sovereign power, the paradoxical point at which the hypertrophy of sovereign violence imposes an impossible choice between killing everyone and killing no one. Either the sovereign proves her sovereignty by exercising her right to use all the violence at her disposal without outside restraints and thereby abolishes herself along with all life, or she declines the rights to the unfettered expression of violence and in doing so forgoes the prerogative that has traditionally defined sovereignty in Western political theory. If the summa malum of the biopolitics population had been the form of mass extermination that Lemkin termed genocide in 1943, then the summa malum of the power to kill life itself was omnicide, coined some ambiguous period in the 1960s, meaning the extermination of, at a minimum, all human life on Earth. Sovereignty had encountered a paradox that was difficult, if not impossible, to get around, and with it, the theory of biopolitics that took the tension between sovereignty and biopower as its central premise. Although violence is by no means hereby abolished, the ultima ratio regis must be articulated much more carefully when this resort of sovereign violence carries with it the irreducible possibility of precipitating what Bertrand Russell called universal death. Sovereign violence had become a victim of its own success, paralyzed by the weight of its own hideous strength. Should it be any surprise to see Foucault's view of sovereignty change drastically during the period in question? In January 1976, he had declared sovereignty to be an absolutely constitutive component of the general mechanisms of power in our society. That March, he experienced his epiphany regarding the potentially insuperable paradoxes that the power to kill life itself imposed on the functioning of contemporary political power. That June, Foucault issued one of his most famous statements of his entire career, remarking in an interview how, quote, "Political theory has never ceased to be obsessed with the person of the sovereign. Such theories still continue today to busy themselves with the problem of sovereignty. What we need, however, is a political philosophy that isn't erected around the problem of sovereignty. We need to cut off the king's head. In political theory, this still has to be done," end quote. A great many political theorists have heeded this call and done brilliant work in thinking through what a post-sovereign politics might look like. However, in our time here, I've invited you to consider the possibility that Foucault's famous call for the king's head might have been less concerned with regicide and more a matter of post-mortem. By the end of 1976, it had become clear that the power to kill life itself had rendered traditional conceptions of sovereignty moribund, and with them, many of the forms of mass extermination that had defined the heyday of the biopolitics of population. For those alive today, the challenge remains one of making political sense of what comes after the functional obsolescence of sovereignty and the paradoxes introduced by the appearance of the power to kill life itself. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, everyone. So, before I begin, I want to thank the organizers for making this conference possible at all, and for allowing me to present my developing work. And before I present my paper, I want to acknowledge that Harvard University is located in the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the neighbors of the Wampanoag and Mi'kmaq peoples, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. As I stand here, I thank them for allowing me, a non-indigenous immigrant, to be an uninvited guest on their sacred lands. I also affirm that this acknowledgement is insufficient. It does not undo the harm that has been done and continues to be perpetrated against indigenous people, their land, and water. This acknowledgement weighs heavily on us, especially in the context of the discussion that follows. My paper diagnoses the psychopathology of the Canadian settler colonial society in an interdisciplinary manner with three connected parts. First, I show the relevance of Winnicottian object relations in recent democratic theorization. Then I use Canadian settler society as a case study and establish its attachment to North American land as object with a short exploration of the Durham Act of 1839. And finally, I show how this attachment turned into an exceptional Oedipal psychopathology. However, I first provide a basic context to the project. So, in the Canadian context at least, there are two major schools of thought concerning indigenous settler relations. The first approach is called reconciliation, since it presents the dominant polity in new, engaging, and supportive ways by studying its reconciliatory relationship to indigenous politics. Contributors to this approach include political theorist James Tully, indigenous legal scholars John Burroughs, Val Napoleon, etc. Here I must also mention political theorist Dale Turner's approach to reconciliation that calls for specially trained indigenous leaders, he calls them word warriors, to discursively participate in the legal and political practices of the Canadian state, such that the notion of aboriginal rights can begin to have some actual tangible meaning for them. In short, reconciliation approaches argue some form of acknowledgement of and engagement with mainstream state politics. On the other hand, radical indigenous responses against the structural and hegemonic domination of the Canadian settler colonial society can be grouped under two camps. On the one hand, there is a growing inward-facing movement towards cultural regeneration. There is a move to guard indigeneity from withering away under constant systemic assaults. This politics of resurgence is exemplified by recent calls to grounded normativity, an ethical framework of indigenous land-based practices and associated systems of knowledge. Glenn Coulthard, Leanne Simpson, Audra Simpson, and others are champions of this approach. I'm also placing the outward-facing response that manifests itself through continuous dynamic and direct actions to protect indigenous lands from the hands of the settler state under this radical manner. Examples are ILO No More, with civilian protests recently, and of course, going back, we have Oka Crisis of 1990, the Louis Concrete struggle of 87-88, the Constitution Express of 1980, etc. So, while I'm unequivocally hitching my tent to the radical camp and acknowledging the immense importance of both indigenous resurgence as well as direct action, I contend that without an immanent critique of settler colonialism, culturally regenerative acts will rightfully and justifiably continue to reject recognition as an extended modern colonial project, as argued for by Glenn Coulthard. while open resistances will continue to result in piecemeal accommodations if and when mandated by the colonial state. My project, this uses theoretical concepts from Western political philosophy to provide an immanent critique of the Canadian settler society and uses a critical psychoanalytical lens to move beyond liberal ideational discourses that are premised on rational reconstruction. In part one, we will see how Winnicottian object relations psychoanalysis is used in modern democratic theorizations. In his most celebrated work, Playing in Reality, British psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott presented his profoundly influential theory of the transitional object with reference to infant psychology. It is the object that the child possesses outside of their own self. It is generally provided by the mother or the primary caregiver and tends to be a soft toy or a blanket. We all have had our, we call it blankie or something. Everyone has that when they grow up. Winnicott calls this first possession the not me object that designates the child's intermediate area of experience. As the child grows older and cultural interests develop, the dependence on the transitional object becomes diffused, but not repressed or forgotten. This diffusion is helped along by the mother or the primary caregiver, who provides both the illusion of the permanence and reality of the object, as well as the frustrating process of weaning and disillusion that helps develop the child's personality. Using French philosopher Bruno Latour's concept of Ding politic, or the thing-based nature of democratic polities, theorists like Bonnie Honig argue that public things like parks, bridges, libraries, town squares, the land itself, are transitional objects in the Winnicottian sense, since they materially and symbolically transition us between private and public, and mediate our relations with others and with ourselves as subjects and citizens. Our attachment to these transitional objects that create the public space for democracies to survive, in turn create our identities as citizens. In other words, our political identity is shaped by our attachment to and use of public things. Which is why Honig, in the context of indigenous political movements, like the ongoing student protest against companies like Chevron and Bridge Insurance Canada, misinterprets a tribe member's impassioned declaration, "We are protecting our critical infrastructure," to mean the land itself and the medicine, berries, fish, and wildlife hunting it provides. Indigenous political identities grow out of their relationship with land. It is not unidirectional like the Winnicottian transitional object, which exists to be used, abused, loved, discarded, destroyed, etc. For example, in the Welete dialect of Dobrid, spoken by people of the Yellowknives Dene First Nation in and around Yellowknife territories, Northwest Territories of Canada, land is translated in relational terms, as that which encompasses not only the land, understood here as material, but also people and animals, rocks and trees, lakes and rivers, and so on. Plus, as indigenous ethical framework and worldview arise from the land-based practices and knowledge systems, it is not an object in the Western philosophical ontological sense. Honig's argument is thus applicable only to non-indigenous societies. Further, I'm arguing that colonized land can be especially analyzed as a transitional public object that created the political identity of the settler society. While through various decolonization movements, colonized lands were relegated to the cultural libidinal limbo where their relevance and dependence became diffuse, for settler colonies like USA, Canada, New Zealand, etc., this necessary disillusionment never took place. So let's now take a brief look at how colonization as an object mastery can be studied in the Canadian context. As a major part of the Canadian Constitution, the British North America Act of 1867 can be traced to the Report on the Affairs of British North America 1839, otherwise known as the Durham Report. Appointed as Governor General in 1838, the Earl of Durham, John Lambton, was requested to submit a report on the rebellion of 1837-38, in which armed battle had broken out between British Upper Canada, or Canada West, and the French Lower Canada, or Canada East. Durham's report is of crucial significance to the foundation of Canada as a state, since following his recommendation, the two colonies were united as the province of Canada in 1841, and later with the joining of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, established the Dominion of Canada under the British North America Act of 1867, when Canada West and Canada East were renamed Ontario and Quebec, respectively. However, not only did the report not once mention Indigenous people, it is here that we find clear and unambiguous references to land as object in the strict Lockean tradition in which Lambton was operating. He saw North America to be the transitional object that would help maintain succeeding generations in an undiminishing affluence of fertile soil. It is also pertinent to mention here that one of the key contributors to the Durham Report was E.G. Wakefield, whom Marx cites extensively in the final chapter of Capital Volume 1. aptly titled Modern Theory of Colonization, and who accompanied Lord Durham during the latter's visit to Canada. According to him, manufacturing wage laborers in the colonies faced a major hurdle since the native lands were public property on which anyone could lay equal claim. This propelled him to propose the scheme of systematic colonization, where the colonial government would set a fixed price on the free lands and turn them into commodities for purchase. Even though he critiques Wakefield's theory of colonization, Marx's notion of the true colonies, defined in the footnotes as virgin soil, and I quote, virgin soil colonized by free immigrants, flows from this very assumption. On this true colony, we are increasing the value of the land, appropriating property, and generally developing the wild commons. In other words, they infuse the land with their mastery, desire, love, disgust, and fantasy. The North American land becomes the first object of possession, that is the transitional object. So, now to the diagnosis. Of the 7 assertions presented by Winnicott in his discussion regarding the relationship between the transitional object and the child, 6 of them unambiguously map onto the settler colonial experience. These are as follows. The infant claims complete omnipotence over the object. It's the exact same thing done by the settler. The object is loved as well as mutilated or harmed. Exact same thing done by the settler. The object remains the same unless changed by the infant. Exact same thing done by the settler. It survives the infant's acts of love and aggression. Again, it provides the infant a reality of its own. And it is not a hallucination, it exists objectively in the real world. However, settler colonialism faltered at the 7th step. Land never lost its meaning, even as a settler colonial society developed. Detachment never became diffuse due to some pathology. Winnicott also presented 2 key characteristics of transitional objects. First of which is that in order to use the object, the subject must first develop the capacity to use the object. This is not an inborn capacity and must necessarily be dependent on a facilitating environment in which the child grows. The Euro-colonial psyche already had the capacity to use the transitional object when it appeared, the discovery of the New World, since the facilitating environment within which it developed was that of Enlightenment-fueled Cartesian license to master the natural world, to see nature as separate from the self, something that needed owning and taming. The second key element is that transitional object is used not to describe the object itself as being transitional, but that it assists the subject's transition from a state of being merged with the mother to a state of being in relation to the mother as something outside and separate. For the colonizers, North America was Mother Nature's gift to them. We find this assertion clearly in Lord Durham's report where he says, North America was the ample appanage that God and nature have set aside in the New World. Thus, while the Constitution Act of 1867 Canada became a self-governing dominion, it also ushered in a slow but crucial change in the colonial unconscious. As Canada starts being referred to as the motherland, which used to be England up until at that point. First notable instance of this change is in a 1927 article penned by a nationalist historian A.R.M. Lower, where he began by stating that the history of the New World is a study in settlement. The title he chose was Canada, a motherland. And with that, the love for and attachment with the transitional object becomes transposed to love and desire for the mother. Meanwhile, given the relationship that indigenous people have with land, plus their hyper-masculinization and the concomitant fear that colonizers felt from their perceived practices and customs, turned them into the primal father. Psychoanalysis, focusing on the development of the child in the Western culture, has maintained that the formation of the ego takes place in the context of familial social relations, that is the Winnicottian environment. Such relations themselves are governed by particular ideological structures that shape the society, of which predominant one is the structure of the Oedipus complex, which is schematically constituted now by the child as a settler, object of desire being the motherland, and the authority figure being the indigenous people themselves. The colonial state's continued pathological desire for and mastery over the land is ensured by its structural regulation and hegemonic domination of the indigenous people. The colonial subject's development is conditioned on the one hand by the reality it helped create with his love and desire towards the Winnicottian object, and on the other hand by the Freudian aggression, which was a response to the reality in which he found himself. This psychopathology results in a type of personality disorder that is perpetually plagued by anxiety, paranoia, shame, etc. Constantly wary of what Marcuse prophesies as the return of the repressed. So we have some symptoms of that in Canada as well. For example, over-the-top armed responses to any form of indigenous protest as paranoia. Anxiety, so anxious to show remorse and relegate colonialism to the dustbins of history, and at the same time manufacturing performative guilt that manifests through perfunctory apologies like the 2008 Prime Minister Harper apology. Or shame, where Canada initially refused to join the UNDRIP in 2007, and then for some reason 3 years later decided, no, okay, let's no. We will do this now. Because a standard understanding of it is the global response to it made them realize that there's a lot of embarrassment and shame associated with this kind of refusal. At this early stage of my research, there are still many unanswered questions that lie ahead. So, for example, how do we establish the settler society without essentializing subjectivities? Then I have a question whether establishing the existence of a political unconscious, I was thinking more in terms of turning towards Frederick Jameson's idea of political unconscious, where he's looking at literary narratives, but I'm more looking towards political narratives, like speeches, official documents, and treaty archives that show these kind of gaps, parapraxis, and underlying tension of a dynamically evolving society, which unconsciously still holds on to the social instinctual drives, and address the developmental teleological assumptions of psychoanalysis. And here I am using Amy Allen's response. Amy Allen's done fantastic work very recently on this very thing. So I will be using that in terms of understanding Freudian, the unofficial Freudian position in terms of a non-developmentalist theory of ego formation. I'm also turning to a Marxist theory of conflict to problematize this further from a more materialist perspective of land dispossession, and engaging further with the role of settler patriarchy in these unconscious gendering of roles. So, as I leave you today, I want to leave you with these words from Lima Rackle, a towering indigenous feminist academic from the Stolo Nation, Canada, who passed away last year in November. Let's not discuss a single thing. Let us not be rational that presumes we are human, warm, sensitive beings, in need of patience, gentleness, and love. The object is not unity, but to win this fight. Retaliate. Thank you very much for your time.
Now, try and invite the chair to offer some comments about the individual papers.
Thank you to all 3 paper presenters. I mean, there's so much on the table, and what I would like to do is just like first, I was just trying to find out some maybe like heuristic, categories or analytics that could kind of tie the very super interesting each of the papers, about the themes, what kind of could allow some sort of interesting conversation with the audience, And one thing that struck me about all papers, what in some ways you're doing, the flip side of the sort of stories, critiques, your analytics that you introduced. In Shukin's case, it's post-colonial cosmopolitanism. In your case, the explosion of the category of sovereignty, because of its sort of intrinsic paradox. Once you have the ability to kill all life on Earth, and in your case, Ritwik, the whole idea of how to, in fact, do an immanent critique based on the psychoanalytic model of the settler's psyche. What I found underneath is a deep critique of what critical theorists would call, the sort of Western propensity towards domination of nature, And in some ways, I think, since also the panel is called, critical approaches, I thought maybe that might be a good way to think about it, because in all 3 papers, what I'm seeing is a very intelligent and a very creative engagement with the sort of Enlightenment tradition, right? But that in some ways there are obviously the big sort of elephant in the room is the contradiction of the universal and the individual, right? In the case, how do you make sense of nation building in the context of a post-colonial effort towards a cosmopolitan world order that in fact takes into account these sort of repressive histories. In the Foucauldian, what Foucault obviously does really well is a total deconstruction, actually, of this narrative of enlightenment leading us to progress, beauty, and happiness ever thereafter, and providing us actually with very interesting, I find useful historic, epistemic, structural analytics in terms of the various forms of power, right? Sovereign, disciplinary, and then as I think Daniel did really nicely illustrate the biopolitical, which I think is actually a new like historical phase, you know, that kind of follows right out of, I mean, in some ways it's interesting, I mean, it's not an accident that he ends with the biopolitical aim, discipline and punish, but it's actually the sort of history or the book that still needs to be written, you know, and I think it speaks actually of our time very much. So I think this is a very super timely, you know, topic to think about, also in connection to technology. What Ritwik does is like a very, I was very intrigued, you know, because it's a very interesting use of Winnicott's object theory, you know, which I personally like. I just like, there's something very humane about the way he describes like child development, and applying it actually to like the colonial settlers, sort of like you know, like their sort of like psyche. And again, there's something about, like, I mean, psychoanalysis in the Freudian sense, of which Winnicott is kind of the the British 1950s sort of like continuation. There seems to be also some sense in which, you know, there is something, you know, within the sort of Western, highly, how do you say, Western, politically damaging, and like the sort of history that we're looking back at is just one catastrophe after another, like genocide and appropriation. But in some ways that you're picking up on a discourse, you know, that in fact that also comes out of that, right? I mean, I think this is really important in terms of like all these sort of like critiques come out of a very specific historical sort of milieu, right? It's a historical discursive milieu, and the way I think of all three papers is actually very, as I said, very creative engagements of like how to like do what we actually do in this sort of ivory tower. You know, we are all creatures. We are all post-enlightenment creatures, and in some ways that's sort of like a work of self-reflexivity, of critical self-reflexivity, of understanding, and this is why we're doing social science, of like contextualization, and understanding, actually trying to make sense with what happened in the past, making sense of our present, but also with this sort of outlook of like, how can we do better, right? I do think that there's what I see in all three papers is a sort of normative thrust, you know, and it is in terms of the normative sort of critique of, you know, domination, and having like different models, alternative models being presented. I think in Daniel's paper it's more implied, I think, but I do think like the fact, I mean, it's like what Foucault does, where there's this like a negative form of critique, right? But then we can draw our inferences from it, and that would be actually very interesting to think about. You know, what are actually the implications of a biopolitical episteme and political situation, right? How does it actually pan out? Having said that, you know, I just, in terms of just like concrete, so this is like the sort of like, overarching what I see as like thematic, and maybe something that we can talk more in detail, you know, looking at the papers. What I really was, like what a question I had for Shugin was, in some ways, I mean, I personally, you know, I love this idea of a cosmopolitanism. I do think it's kind of like an age-old Enlightenment dream, right? And it is something that it's in some ways also within this whole idea of not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, right? I mean that I mean what I'm wondering about is like how you like in terms of our, you know, like in terms of our times, you know, is this like a vision? And I mean, I really love your like interesting take of like kind of minimizing sort of the nation building aspects of post-colonial theory, and really trying to bring to fore actually there is this sort of strong drive towards egalitarianism, and that in some ways that might be a much more powerful analytic and category to think about post-colonial construction, you know, or like global justice actually as such, you know. And I do think it's actually very like a a very fruitful sort of way to think about it, because what was the cosmopolitan ideal, right? And how do we reinscribe like freedom, equality, fraternity? You know, they might be empty phrases, they might be in bad faith given the history that we are criticizing and reflecting on. But at the same time, it does express some sort of longing for humanity, right? It's like, how can we I love the poem that you how can we exist on this earth, in this sort of like Kantian sense of eternal, peace. And I don't think it's just like some sort of like naivete. I think it's actually, it is a deep longing. And I do feel like it is actually the normative ground on which we're doing the kind of work that we're doing. So I think we need to be honest about this and not to be cynical, right? In terms of Foucault, what I would be interested in is just like how, is he, like the question I would have for Daniel is like, how do you think about, is this, you didn't mention it in your presentation, but your paper itself, you actually have, if I understood correctly, some more like a big question about mankind, right? Because in some ways, I think Foucault's reflections in this fateful 6 month in 1976 actually really, I think it's so prescient, actually, in the situation that we find ourselves in, in ways that it really opened a new sort of like, I was always aware of like his sort of biopolitical sort of discussion, but this really crystallized to me in some ways, and in much more existentially sharp ways, what Hart and Negri did in Empire, right, when they appropriate the biopolitical, right? But this is actually much more like, I think, closer to what we're experiencing now after the digital revolution and this whole sort of technology that is actually available to us, at this point. But back then, gene editing was just started, but we are now actually in a phase where this is not anymore some sort of like dream or, projected future. The future is now. And I think that like that sort of existential thread of like this idea of sovereignty coming to its sort of paradoxical endpoint, right? It's almost like a little bit like sovereignty as such as a category has reached its end of history, because in some ways it's canceling itself out. So, right, then what does it mean for political theory? Is that because it seems like so much of political theory, of political philosophy is structured around that, initiated by Thomas Hobbes, right? The question of what is a sovereign? But in fact, maybe we need to have much more sophisticated and much more nuanced ways, and maybe I think we can use actually the sort of like epistemic structural periodization that Foucault is providing, right? That in some ways sovereignty is actually really part of the ancien regime. You have disciplinary power where the power of locus is not actually the sovereign anymore, it's institutions. And then the question is, where is the power of locus now in the biopolitical era? If we adopt that sort of framework, and I would think, I don't know, is it corporations? I don't have an answer to this, but I feel like that's actually the sort of like challenge. And then rethinking actually tactics and strategies of political philosophy or political theory to in fact provide, theories and frameworks and categories and analytics that are adequate actually to our historical period, where we're really like we're face to face, with extinction. And I think the category of sovereignty is actually a really beautiful trope. Not beautiful, actually it's a scary trope, in fact, of the sort of, the sort of like cul-de-sac that we've driven ourselves in if we abide by this sort of like, I think a comportment of domination, which in some ways, like describes, to use like Adorno and Horkheimer's notion, of like the dialectic of enlightenment is one of the domination of nature, rationalization, extraction, all these sort of like like the violence, that is inherent to this, that we think about it, not just like switching the binary, but like really thinking about alternative models, and I think the cosmopolitan, I think also looking at indigenous sort of like contributions. I just read for the first time this year Weber Canu's like critique, his whole like language book. I forgot the name, but it's basically an indigenous philosopher who really like deconstructs this sort of worldview, the Western, worldview of subjection, and then contrasts this with how indigenous cosmologies are totally differently structured, And I think in terms of the psychoanalytic discourse that you are, entering into, I mean, one thing that I was wondering, is like how, I mean, you can only like use this actually for the settler, the settlers, just because, I mean, I would feel like it would be some form of like violence, a form of like analytic violence to use actually these categories for people who actually didn't grow up or don't share actually this worldview. Because if you think about it, if you look really at the Freudian sort of, I mean, Freud himself, psychoanalysis is a very historically constructed, you can like think about it as an ethnography of fantasy Viennese culture, And it says something about ways of like, that can only like his discovery of the unconscious, his sort of like topographical like understanding, the model of our psyche is obviously very much of that, of a particular sort of like, Western Enlightenment sort of like trajectory, right? And in fact, what's interesting is like both Winnicott and both Freud emphasize the whole idea of mastery of the object, which in self is in some ways already biased, right? I mean, I wonder, just as a speculative thing, I would imagine other cultural sort of like narratives around how we deal with objects might have a very different approach to it, in the sort of ontological comportment sense that you don't comport yourself in terms of I have to master something. I mean, what both those theories show, Freud has a similar sort of story in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, when he observes his grandson, reacting to the leave of his mother. Whenever the mother leaves, he starts playing this game, the Fort Da game, where he throws his toy, it's on a string, he throws it away, and then he puts it back, and he says, fought, and then, and it's back. And then whenever he pulls it towards him, there's like this joyous sort of like, yeah, I did it. And his interpretation is, oh yeah, this is, in some ways, there's some trauma, of like the mother leaving, and the way in which the child copes with his anxiety is in fact using this toy, this object, to exert control over it, right? It's this sort of like the notion of I'm mastering this, and in that way that creates a sort of joyousness and that sense of self, But the question is it like, this is what I find so interesting. It's again about mastery. It's about object. And the new narrative, what I found like somewhat like problematic is like the way in which you have, in Winnicott's narrative, the mother, you have actually an original love for your mother, you merged with the mother, and if there's good enough mothering, he calls it, then actually the child is able to like separate and get a sense of like the mother and I am not the same, because before you live in this magical grandiose world where when you want to eat, the breast magically appears. So you're like, oh, I have all these powers over this breast, but actually, eventually the mother's like, no. And that comes a big like fall from grace, and they have to now understand, like, learn how to like, make deal good with this. And this is where the transitional object comes in, right? It's again that sense of you are having this other thing that you can exert control over that you cannot exert over this other subject, who's the mother, right? But that's how you, in fact, think of, create yourself or like come into being as a person, What I find like problematic. I mean, the narrative that you're providing us here is like there is the mother, then the settlers, they leave the motherland, England, they come to Canada or North America. They perceive, the land as a transitional object, but then there's again this love for the mother, but it's just like, so they're never getting out of that sort of like merging state, right? And that's the psychopathology or the sort of like deviance of the normal development that should have happened, right? But the question is, first of all, like, this is like is it the same mother, or is it just like, is this like a history of trauma in some ways, that there's something about leaving your motherland and finding a new mother is like, and then like merging that kind of prevented it. It's just like, in some ways you can diagnose it, but there's a sense in which I'm not quite clear how, in fact, why it's not, what are the other conditions that prevent them actually to let go? Because even, like most children do, right? Eventually we grow out, is that there was never good enough mothering to begin with, because that's what Winnicott says, in order for children to in fact like go through this phase, more or less intact, you need a sense of security. You need a sense of being contained, And that's precisely, the sense like, is that missing, that sort of containment, And then you actually develop like these obsessive compulsive sort of attachments to the object. The other thing is like, what happened, I'm not, like the part about the indigenous people as fatherly authority, I need to hear more about that, because that seems, I don't know, it's just like, in the fact is, why is the authority, being dominated? What makes it this, what gives it the status of authority? Is it just psychic, or is it just something, imagined? Because it's clearly not the case that the indigenous people have authority, just like on a material, like political sense, So I want to wrap up because Nani is giving me like secret hand signs. So very, having, I'm just like, I would love, to hear, like, just like kind of opening up the discussion in terms of, what you're sort of, just to bring it back into the present, what sort of like, what motivated your sort of inquiry, and how you see actually in the difference of instantiations, alternative narratives maybe, not necessarily that they have to be opposed to sort of Enlightenment discourse, but in ways in which we can, to like echo Schukian's, the sense in which also post-colonial subjects appropriate their own sort of cultures, but then also the European culture that in some ways left a mark on them, right? And in that sort of in the best sense of the Enlightenment, how we can kind of critically like think about ways in which to salvage the parts that are good, and then also and the sort of way, the mode of critique that we are all using, how we can use that in order to in fact maybe create a sort of like globally just world order that's that really reflects actually on the political, material, social, economic level, the ideals that we purport to hold. So.